If you're newer to programming, you've probably found yourself writing these if-else statements that chain together and they get ridiculously long. One of the challenges with this is that the code starts to get unreadable. Now, depending on your level of experience, you might have heard of this other option that we have available to us, and that's called the switch statement. Now, a switch statement won't necessarily shrink the number of conditions you have in your if-else chain. However, it can be more expressive, so in this video we're going to look at the basics of using a switch statement, and if you stay right to the end of this video, we'll talk about using switch statements with enums and some of the dangers that you're going to want to avoid. Now, instead of my usual format for these videos, I'm not going to jump over to Visual Studio to show you code. Instead, I'm going to jump over to a blog article that I've written on my site, devleader.ca. And this is just a great opportunity for a reminder that I do have a free weekly newsletter, so in one of the pinned comments, I'll leave a link where you can subscribe to that. I send out software engineering topics and .NET examples, and often I have exclusive articles and early access to YouTube videos. So if you're looking for more learning opportunities, I highly recommend you subscribe there. It's totally free. Alright, let's dive into devleader.ca. On my screen, I'm showing a simple example of a switch statement, and the way that this switch statement is organized, if you've never seen one or never used one before, is that we are able to have a switch on a particular variable. Now, this variable that we're using here, in this case, number, is an integer, which we can see declared above, and the interesting thing that we're able to do with switch statements is define different cases for that number that we want to handle. So you can see when we declare case 1 here, that means that when we're handling this switch statement, we're going to exercise this code block here when the number is 1. So this is functionally equivalent to having something like if number equals 1, then you would have this line of code within that. And then similarly, when you have this case 2 here, that would be like saying else if number equals 2, then go run this code here. You can continue this pattern down for case 3 as well, and then we have this special default case at the bottom. And again, to use comparisons to if statements, the default case is like having an else. So when we have a number that is not handled by one of these cases above here, we're able to fall into this default case. And that means that we would go run this line right here, where we're saying the number is neither 1, 2, nor 3, if the number was something like 4 or 5. So looking at this example we have on the screen, if we were to walk through the flow of this code, number is set to 5, so we would check this, and that case is not true because the number is not 1. Same thing here, the number is not 2, the number is not also 3, and then we would flow into this default case, and we would say, well, the number is neither 1, 2, nor 3. So that's how this code would execute for a switch statement. Now, you might be looking at that switch statement and saying, well, I can write if statements without some of the curly braces, and I can collapse my whole if-else chain of if statements into something way shorter than that. So isn't that more readable? Isn't that easier to understand? And this is just my friendly reminder to you that having less lines of code is not necessarily something that's more readable. It's the same thing if you were to make the argument that you could collapse a bunch of code onto one really long line. And one really long line is significantly less readable than many shorter, narrow lines that are stacked vertically. If you don't believe me, try it out in some of your own code, because you'll find if you have to keep scrolling with your eyes really far to the right, using your scroll bar in your IDE to be able to go read the whole line, and then go scroll all the way back, it's way more work than having more narrow and more stacked lines of code. So in this particular case, when we're looking at a switch statement, having more lines is not necessarily like it's making it less readable. And there's some other properties about switch statements that we're going to look at next that give you some other abilities over if statements. So let's go back and check that out now. So continuing on with our original example here, some things that we want to look at for switch statements are what we're allowed to put for cases. And switch statements have this requirement that we need to have constant values for the cases. So if you had a complex if statement logic where the comparisons you were doing to number or other things that you were looking at were not dealing with constants, then this switch statement syntax would not necessarily work for you. The values that you have after case must be constants. And that has to do with how the compiler translates the switch statement into IL, or intermediate language. One more thing to touch on briefly before we continue on to the next example is the word break that we see here. And we can see it for every case, including the default case. The word break is required in a switch statement to be able to break out of the condition that we're looking at. So for example, in this switch statement, if the number was 1 and the case 1 was matched here, break ensures that we're not going to flow over to the other cases. And that might surprise you because if you're not familiar with how this syntax looks, you might have thought just by exercising case 1 and doing this line here that we would automatically be complete. But the reality is, no, we could flow through from case to case without having a break here. And we have another keyword that we can use that's not just break, and that's return. So you are able to return out of a case and leave the entire method by having a return here instead of a break. And that applies to all of the other cases as well as the default case as well. So if you needed to exit a method strictly by matching a case, you're able to do that with the return, and you can return a value out of here as well. So 2 things to keep in mind, like I said, you must have constant values here, and you are able to use breaks or returns here, and in fact, you will likely want to have breaks and returns throughout this for the most part. But what if you don't? What if you want to be able to collapse some of these together? So for example, what if you wanted to do even and odd numbers? What if you wanted to say if I have 2, 4, 6, that I want to be able to have something printed to the console that instead of saying the number is whatever the number is, that it's even or odd? Well, we can go ahead and do that, and let's go see how. So using another example here, we have a switch statement using a string. So just to kind of illustrate that we can use strings as well as integers, and that's because the cases are constant, we can do something like days of the week. So here we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and what we are trying to do is saying that for any of these, it's a weekday. And you'll notice that the syntax is slightly different as a result. And just like I was saying for even and odd numbers, we're able to strip out the break or possible return that you might want to put and have these cases stacked together. So that way we can have Monday through Friday all having the same sort of handler for when the case is met. At that point, we want to be able to break out so that we don't flow to these other cases below. So that means if we walk through this example and we have Tuesday being assigned to day of the week, when we go into this switch statement, we would flow through and say, is it Monday? Nope. Is it Tuesday? Yep. And then from there, we would go into this part of the handler here, exercise this line of code, and then break out. So you can, in fact, remove break statements or return statements from the cases and flow between the different cases. And this is a perfect example of that. To build on top of that, if we wanted to look at a weekend, and that would mean Saturday or Sunday, in this particular case, no pun intended, we would be able to flow over these ones because it's not going to match if you had a Saturday as an example. But as soon as we got to this case, it would, and we would go exercise this line. Similarly, for Sunday, you would flow through the same way and skip over Saturday, but still use the same handler that Saturday had. Now, before I talk about one of the other patterns that we see very frequently with switch statements and some of the dangers that go along with that, I want to walk through a switch expression, which is slightly different, but the syntax looks very similar. This is something newer in CSharp that we're able to use, and how we leverage it looks a little bit different. So I want to walk through this next example first, and then we'll talk about this other usage of switch statements and some of the dangers that go along with it. So on my screen, I have what is called a switch expression, and if you're looking at it, the syntax looks very similar, but we're missing some of the keywords and the structure is slightly different. So what's going on with this switch expression? Well, the switch expression allows us to get a result out. So it's like having something that gets returned and assigned into this variable here on the left side of the equal sign. And what we're able to do is say that we want to switch on some variable. So the syntax is in sort of this reverse order and we don't have parentheses around value, but we have value and then we're going to switch on it. And then we have our cases inside here. But what's really nice and elegant about this syntax is that instead of having case written out for every single line, we just define what the case is. And then we have this arrow syntax, which is what we use for lambdas, anonymous delegates, and that kind of thing, to be able to define the handler, or in this case, the return value that we want to have assigned into this result. So if we had an example where we initialized value to the word second, so this case right here, the way that this would work is that we would go switch on this condition would not match, but this condition would in fact match. So this side of the arrow, which says the second value, would be sort of returned out of this switch expression and then assigned into this string result. If we had the word third and it's not going to match either first or second, we would end up going into this default case. And the way that we define that is with this underscore, which is a discard in C#, this arrow syntax, and then the value that we want to have returned. So while a normal switch statement allows you to have these cases defined and you can have breaks and returns and then handle things just like you would an if-else statement, what's really cool about the switch expression is that it allows you to do something similar with slightly nicer syntax. I think it feels a little bit less robust, but still very readable, and return a value to be assigned into a variable. So if you're looking to do an assignment combined with a switch statement, it's a really nice and elegant way to be able to do that. And now I want to talk about switch statements with something else, and that's going to be enums. So let's go check that out on the blog article. All right, so on my screen, I am sharing another example using an enum type with a switch statement, and I just have the final curly brace cut off here at the bottom. I apologize, but just wanted to fit this in to make it nice and readable. So we have an enum that we've declared up here called user type, and it has three values: admin, moderator, and user. From there, we're just declaring a variable called user type and assigning it to user just for this example. So as we step through this particular switch statement, what's really nice about switch statements and enums is that we can define each case based on one of the enum values. So if you recall earlier, I was saying that we need to operate with constants. The nice thing is that when we're dealing with enums, something like userType.admin is in fact a constant. It's going to map to a numeric value, but it's nice and readable for us. So when you combine the switch statement with an enum, we have the same type of behavior that we saw earlier, so I don't need to necessarily walk through how all of this code is handled, but I just wanted to show you this nice readability we get when we stack these different cases with the different enum types. But what's the danger of using switch statements with enums? The example we just checked out looked pretty good. It was nice and readable, we had a default case, everything seemed to check out. Well, in order to understand that, we're going to explore enums next. So check out this video series and it'll start to all make sense.